Across much of the developing world, there's a deep distrust of the World Bank. What do you say to that?
20 years ago, Ryan, I was actually part of a movement that tried to close the World Bank. I'm the president now, so I'm very glad that that movement failed.
Developing countries are America's largest and fastest growing export market. International cooperation hurts no one. It helps millions.
The World Bank and its partners will continue to develop and repeat projects with the aim of empowering poor people and giving them a voice.
In the World Bank, we have set ourselves a goal of ensuring that within the next 2 years, at least 50% of our operations have gender-focused components in them.
I'm full of hope as to what we at the World Bank Group can help countries do to end extreme poverty and boost shared prosperity.
"20 years ago, Yong Kim was an activist calling for the abolition of the World Bank. Today, he's its president. We met with President Kim to discuss the World Bank's past efforts to fight poverty and its struggle to stay relevant in a changing world. Across much of the developing world, there's a deep distrust of the World Bank. There's a widespread belief that the World Bank attaches stringent conditions to its loans. What do you say to that?
Well, 20 years ago, Ryan, I was actually part of a movement that tried to close the World Bank. I'm the president now, so I'm very glad that that movement failed. But the movement was really addressed at some of these concerns. And I have to say, over the last 20 years, I've never seen an institution that changed as much as the World Bank has changed. We don't give prescriptions anymore. All the projects that we're doing are done completely with the agreement of the countries that we serve. And we're now in a very different position and approach the work in a very different way. One of the critiques of the World Bank Group is that the only thing they cared about was growth of GDP. One of the problems is that people who don't deal with us on a daily basis don't realize how much we have changed.
Tell us a bit about the bad old days, because if we were going to look at that period in fairness, you could say that there were a lot of concerns about accountability. There were many concerns about governments that were not necessarily broadly representative of their populations, and so there might have been a belief that, hey, we need to impose these conditions lest this money be wasted. What would you say was the logic of these early architects of the World Bank in imposing those conditions?
Well, if you really go back to the very beginnings of the World Bank, 1944, it was really an incredible set of meetings. There's a wonderful book that just came out called The Summit that describes 3 weeks of lots of alcohol consumption, lots of parties, but they were there because they were trying to prevent the kind of wild fluctuations in exchange rates that were happening before the war.
Washington, the Bretton Woods monetary agreements are ratified. Acting Secretary of State Dean Acheson officiates at the signing of the pact by 28 nations.
The original notion was that the funds would be used to rebuild Europe. But then the Marshall Plan was announced, and then slowly the turn started moving toward poverty. And so in many situations, the governments were unstable, there was a lot of corruption, and the World Bank at that time tried very much to control what happened so that all the money was not lost. But still, we didn't talk about corruption openly until 1996. We then decided that we were going to actually name it for what it is. We're going to investigate every single one of our projects to detect corruption, and then we're going to sanction those people who are responsible for it.
When you talk about corruption, it seems like one of these issues that is so multifaceted and so deeply entrenched in many societies that it's the kind of thing where you need a lot of domestic buy-in. How can an international, multilateral institution have an effect on what is ultimately a domestic process of building trust?
And I'll just give you a couple of examples of how we've done that. In Afghanistan, we have a bunch of projects, and it's difficult to go out and supervise them every day. We gave groups of women from the community cell phones. And in exchange for getting cell phone minutes so they could talk to each other, we asked them to take pictures of the project. And so they had their little cell phone cameras. They took the pictures and they uploaded them and sent them back to our main office so that we could see that people were actually working on these projects as they were supposed to. So the most important thing about rooting out corruption is, first of all, you have to have a very high standard and you have to be determined to investigate it when it comes up. But the other part of it is to get the entire community involved in holding people accountable.
You've committed the World Bank to two very big, ambitious goals, one of which is ending extreme poverty in the world in the next couple of decades, and the other is to have all countries, not just developing countries, emphasize income growth for the bottom 40%. What are better ways to kind of leverage your necessarily limited resources to achieve these enormous goals?
The thing that you really have to focus on, since 70% of those in extreme poverty live in rural areas, is increasing the productivity of agriculture. We are now working more closely with the Asian Development Bank, Inter-American Development Bank, African Development Bank, Islamic Development Bank. We're working more closely with them and the IMF than we ever have before. Only if we bring all these institutions together, leverage every bit of our capital to, for example, bring private investors in. That's how we're going to reach this goal.
The World Bank has long given pride of place to a collection of liberal democracies. But when you talk about this variety of other multilateral bodies and also this capital that's out there in the world, there are some institutions, including, some argue, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, that might see conditionality differently. They might say, gosh, we want to support other governments that are much like ours, that don't necessarily have the same approach to liberal norms. Do you see that as potentially problematic?
This is a multilateral institution, so whatever it decides is going to have to be decided along with the UK and Germany and France, who have been, very strong supporters and core members, of course, of the boards of the World Bank, of the IMF, and of the other institutions. So the overlapping nature of the governing boards, I think, are going to make the conversation very different than a single country deciding all the rules.
I do want to talk briefly about this idea of promoting shared prosperity. One of the barriers to promoting shared prosperity is that in some countries, the distribution of political power is such that the people in the bottom 40% just don't have very much voice. As an outside multilateral institution, how can you actually tilt the balance on that?
Growth is extremely important. Now, efforts to reduce inequality are also really important, but there are ways of doing it in a way that you both grow the economy and reduce inequality and ensure that the bottom 40% have a share of that growth. So, for example, in Africa, what you see is rapid growth of the GDP without much benefit for the bottom 40%. How can you take the proceeds from that kind of growth and ensure that you're preparing young people for the job market, that you're providing the kind of education and skills training that will prepare them for the kind of productive work that will reduce inequality? What we're suggesting is that there are ways to build roads, to supply energy, to invest in education and healthcare that actually have a disproportionate impact on the bottom 40%. That's what we're going to focus on.
Thanks very much for your time.
Thank you, Ryan.